the sort of talk. What I wanted was this to be the sort of talk that actually we might normally have in the bar, or between, I immediately go to that, or between papers, or during the sort of conference dinner, where I think I've actually learned a lot of the most interesting stuff. Not to say that papers aren't always brilliant, but the great thing about conferences is that you can actually have conversations with each other and say, oh, I never really thought about that. And where did you find that? And what's your thinking about this? So I thought I'd try to sort of replicate that a little bit today as well. And I really wanted to mull over the sort of material that's available. I have a subtitle, which I will eventually explain, I hope, which is Agatha Christie, The Unstoppable Passage of Time and a Burning Toilet Seat. That will, I hope, eventually make sense to you all. Now, the other inspiration for this talk was actually that I was doing something for a documentary last year, and I was being interviewed the same day as Laura Thompson, who I don't know, but I'm sure, I don't know personally, but I'm sure you all know is a Christie biographer. And we were having a very brief conversation. And I said to her that I thought it was amazing to look back at the work of both biographers, and especially thinking about when Janet Morgan was doing her biography in the early 80s, that so much material was difficult to access because of a pre-internet, little things like checking biographical details of people that she met. All of this sort of stuff is very, very time consuming. And Laura Thompson was quite right. And she said, well, yes, there is that, but also at least the people were alive then. And I thought that actually was a really good way of looking at the sort of positives and negatives of the passage of time, that actually you can learn a lot more about some things, but also other things then become lost to you. So there's never really a perfect time to write any sort of history, I would say, because you're learning more at the same rate that you are losing things. So yeah, I thought that now I've been doing this sort of research for about 10 years or so, which is not really that long in sort of history senses. But even over those 10 years, I've started to learn a lot more about what is available and what perhaps is tougher to get hold of, things that perhaps are not so available now, but have been available in the past. And also, frankly, because I'm not quite in between projects, but I'm certainly a long way away from publishing anything substantial about Agatha Christie. So I wanted to save a couple of really nice things I've got, actually. So next time we're all together for the Agatha Christie conference, I've got something that's a real cracker of a thing that I want to share. But it can wait until sort of slightly closer to that. So I thought, well, now would be a really good time to really think about the process and see what other people think as well. So the scope of Agatha Christie research is growing and growing and growing. And I think that has been a really interesting thing. And I think that this conference, this series of conferences is responsible for that in no small way. You know, Jamie and then Mia coming in very soon, sort of quicker, the second year, and then sort of Sarah and Stefano and even myself for a year. I think it's really helped to see that there is a lot of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary discussion to be had about this, about Agatha Christie. So we know there's still loads to discuss, and that it always amazes me at every conference that there are lots of new and exciting things to talk about that perhaps I've never even particularly been thinking about before. So the endless Agatha Christie, as I've sort of thought about it for today, that every time you think, oh, that thing seems to be fairly well covered, very often actually you can find that there is actually a lot more out there that you haven't actually had the chance to sort of really discuss. So, for example, I don't know how many of you even remember or even knew at the time about things such as the Mr. Quinn app. The Mr. Quinn app, which launched at the end of 2015 and ran for a little while during 2016. That is something that actually has been pretty much forgotten and is actually very difficult to access information about. You'll see a picture there. That's the actor Gethin Anthony, who played Mr. Satterthwaite, actually, not Mr. Quinn. But if you want to find out more information about that, there are some press releases from the time, but the app no longer functions, no longer exists. It's removed from the app stores. The website is dead. And I contacted some of the sort of rights holders in it to find out what material might be available for me to look at, and they didn't hold anything at all. So this app, which was sort of a game where it was like a social media, like you were following conversations on social media, and you could book in to some sort of live events where you might watch a party going on or something like that, and then be able to put the clues together. It was based on one of the Mr. Quinn's short stories, the first one. But what you actually ended up with was something that perhaps a few thousand people experienced 5.5 years ago, and now we have next to no real information about. I know that I had the app, and I know that I sort of tried it out for an hour or two, but that was pretty much it. And so now this is something that even in recent history has really gone on to disappear quite quickly. Even if we look at the more obvious material, though, and I'm not going to list any specifics, so I think someone will correct me right away, but there are Christie novels and short stories and plays and poems that have really been discussed very little, both in scholarship and beyond. There's lots of Agatha Christie material that actually has not been discussed very much at all. We're not, though, going to run out of things to discuss any time soon. So that's a great thing for us. It means that we're going to have loads and loads of material to discuss, but will we run out of actual primary and archival material? Just before I move on to the next slide, Mia, could you just let me know if people can see the slides okay, because I just had a little glitch. You there, Mia? Or for anybody?
Okay.
Great, thank you, Mia. Sorry,
no problem at all.
My screen went funny for a moment.
No, we're all good.
Still see. Great. So, something old, something new. This, for me, is, I think, the most important thing about doing this sort of research, is that you have to accept that almost everything you look at is going to have been seen by quite a lot of people before. So, both my books about the screen adaptations and about the history of Poirot, they both showed that there is loads of evidence and information that we know lots of people have looked at. So, for example, all of the material at the University of Exeter, which is where her agent's papers are held, and is certainly the most sort of wide-ranging source of material directly related to Agatha Christie. Anything that's held there has been seen by hundreds of people probably by now. But the point is that it hasn't always been used. And I want to be really clear that I'm not criticizing people for not using it, but because any of us who are doing research are going to be looking for something about a particular sort of subsection, a particular topic. So maybe one day somebody will write about the history of Agatha Christie's houses, and you will find loads about the maintenance of those houses and her relationship with gardeners, and some that were difficult and some that seemed to be much better, and all of this sort of stuff, which is not relevant for my discussion and might garner a brief mention in a biography. But it's there, people have seen it, but very few in sort of schemes of people who might be interested. So new doesn't necessarily mean finding things that no one's ever looked at. It can mean actually saying this seems to be relevant, and that actually this seems to be helpful. So it's really helped me to rethink a little bit about what we might consider to be new, because new can mean actually taking material that's been available for quite some time and saying, well, actually, I think that this is important to this discussion, or that people have sort of overlooked this just because they didn't need it. And that actually, in terms of what I want to discuss, this can be really, really helpful. We do, though, also have to accept, those of us who are doing more sort of history stuff, that there are some areas that have been really, really well covered, and you are going to struggle to find anything that's really new. So the 1920s is particularly tough. There's a couple of dozen letters relating, or from Agatha Christie or directly to her, and really everything that's interesting has been gone over many, many times, including, I'm sure everybody here has probably heard the story about the dispute over the spelling of cocoa in The Mysterious Affair at Styles and whether it should have an A at the end. The reason why that story gets told time and time again is because it's one of the very few that we've got a really good letter that outlines one of her interactions with her publisher. Things do still pop up, and there are still things that perhaps we can look at, and I'm going to discuss one or two of those in a minute. But on the whole, you sort of got to accept that. So what have we lost in the last 40, 50, 60 years. Obviously, interviews with most people who knew her well. Not everybody, but of course that pool of people is shrinking all of the time. I think last year one of her gardeners at Greenway, who knew her very well, passed away, and had never spoken about her, had always declined interviews, which is fair enough. But again, it's another person who knew her very well. Some archival material, very little. I think most of it actually largely due to the great work of Exeter, but also John Curran with the family archive. Lots of it is still around, but there are a few sort of missing bits. Some of the files, certainly from her agent, have gone walkabout at some point. There are a couple of years that are missing in the 50s, and they might turn up at some point. And there are a couple of things that are mentioned by Janet Morgan in her book, which is 1984, I think, which I've never been able to find the original source for. And we know Janet Morgan's a reliable source, so she's not making it up, but where it's gone since, not quite sure. But also, this is actually something that I think we're starting to lose stuff in the modern day, because actually moving away from letters, which have got carbon copies and all sorts of things, to phone calls, WhatsApp conversations, emails, that means that actually in the future, when we're wanting to think about our discussions of this sort of related Agatha Christie materials, such as adaptations, computer games, new editions of novels, whatever, actually the paperwork's not going to be there. And I started to come up across this in the Poirot book in particular, that once you get to sort of 2000 or so, suddenly things really start to shrink, and you're starting to rely on interviews, and we certainly know from interviews that you're not necessarily getting the whole story, which I definitely found with the Poirot and Miss Marple series, the Joan Hicks and Miss Marple and the David Suchet Poirot, not because anyone was hiding anything, but because actually you can find out quite a lot from paperwork that people have either forgotten because it didn't seem that important, or have perhaps didn't seem that relevant when they were discussing it before. So loads of things can be revealed anecdotally, and paperwork can only say so much. So we have a real mix here of wanting to hear from the people, but also wanting to see things like the paperwork. And when we think Agatha Christie was living 1890 to 1976, we're really moving towards the edge now of what we might consider to be living memory. And Janet Morgan references one thing that I think is really interesting, one of many actually, where she says that one old friend visiting the house at the end of Agatha's life explained she gave a shine to her decanters by rinsing them in Sterident. She noticed how Agatha immediately fixed on this remark as a possible device for a story. Now, that's one of the things that you can only really hear anecdotally. That's not going to be written down anywhere. And so I think there are these really fascinating little glimpses. And I know that John Curran, I think, tried to unpick that a bit further by looking at the outlines for stories in her diaries that didn't come to anything. But we have gained things as well. Archives are still alive, and I would say probably more accessible than ever if we ignore COVID, which we're all going to do. Digitized archives, newspapers, magazines. When I did my PhD a million years ago, which was not about Agatha Christie, but was about early British TV, I was looking at newspaper reactions. And the only real digitized newspaper, British newspaper, was The Times, which went up to 1985, I think, at that time. So we've come on massively since then. The days that I was manually going through copies of things like the Daily Express at the British Library is now much, much easier. And it also means that you can find things that are in unusual places. And also, of course, a lot more scholarship about Christie and her contemporaries. And some odd biographical information can therefore turn up in these things through things like keyword searches. So here is, for example, taken from the Brisbane Telegraph, although probably was printed elsewhere and was syndicated as a diary item story there, about Rosalind Christie, later Rosalind Hicks, Agatha's only child. About her coming out and about preparations for that when she was sort of becoming a woman and when she was sort of being introduced to the world in 1937. I don't think there's a paper in that, as there's certainly not a book in that. But you start to put these little bits of extra information together and suddenly you're shaping some interesting stories, I think. So when using the archives, I was very conscious that I felt it was always possible to find something new, even if you're the 100th person to look at something, because the application is interesting, as well as the raw information. There are challenges, not least decoding Agatha Christie's handwriting, which is, I say there's somebody with appalling handwriting, and she had appalling handwriting. So that's really tough. There are a few people in the world who can decipher it, and so we're in their sort of debt. And also things like scrutinizing typescript. So I said about how there isn't much from the 1920s. Well, actually, one of the things that I did do for the Poirot book, which hadn't really been done before, at least not to any great extent, was to look at the different versions of stories. So from any typescripts that still existed, through to the magazine publications, through to the book. So we would get things like, I mentioned the affair at the Victory Ball in the chat earlier, but actually that whole story, the second half of it in particular, is almost completely rephrased from the original typescript to the version published in the sketch. So the sentences mean the same, but the phrasing is different. And I can't really explain that. Perhaps it was an editor who was extra keen, or maybe Agatha decided to do a full redraft. But also even that, which was the first of the Poirot short stories, has got 3 different openings: the typescript opening, the one that's in the sketch magazine, and the one that's in the book, so when collected in books. They're all different, not massively, but they're all different. And so there's loads that we can perhaps learn from looking at that. And also, while doing all of this, I'm very conscious of time here, but just to say in the last few minutes, so we're of course also updating past histories, and I'm very pointedly not saying correcting, because you can only be as correct as you feel at any given time with all the evidence you've got, because that includes myself. So like the story I tell of the origin of the Poirot series in Agatha Christie on Screen is not incorrect, but it's missing some really important details that actually make you think about it quite differently. And I only found out about that from a chance uncovering of one particular document. Also things like I happened to find when going through her notebooks on the rear side of a ripped out page that she'd started to sketch out ideas for doing a play of The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which even Julius, who's written as encyclopedic a book as you could possibly imagine, had not seen, because I think he'd been told there wasn't anything there to help him. And actually there is, when you go through it and you look at it again. And sometimes you're looking at unreferenced claims in older books and thinking, well, is this because they knew this at the time and this is the evidence has been lost, or were they just sort of hoping no one would check? And for example, Peter Haining, who wrote Murder in 4 Acts about various adaptations of Agatha Christie, spoke about this apparent adaptation of Wireless, or Where There's a Will, on a TV series. And it took me weeks and weeks to track it down. I had to get it from an archive. Of course, now it's out on DVD typically. And it's absolute nonsense. It's absolutely not an adaptation. There is nothing at all to indicate, either in the paperwork or in the episode, that it's an adaptation. It just shares the same title. And that took me weeks. I mean, not 9 to 5 work, but weeks to actually get that. And also little things like you might look at 2 different interviews with Agatha Christie, and there is one in particular where actually it is phrased slightly differently depending on which source you used. So which one's actually the real truth, the real word of Agatha Christie? Well, who knows? I generally go back closest to the archive as I can, but it's difficult. So my final really thoughts are that I don't think there's anything that's really significant in terms of biographical information to be found about Agatha Christie. No massive revelations, but there's still loads of things to find out. Including the legacy of the work, including analysis, which is so important, and I really haven't been able to speak about in my 20 minutes. But there are areas that are perhaps less discussed. I know that those of you who might be going to the Agatha Christie Festival in September, there's the premiere of a new documentary about Agatha's archaeological work. There's loads of stuff still being found out about that, for example. Loads of things that we could still find out more about, because so often, as I say, it's about interpreting the information. And as for that toilet seat to finish off with, well, because after somebody had read my Poirot book and they sent me a very nice email about it and said, I don't think this was really for the book, but you might be interested that I worked as an archaeologist in the 1980s at the British Institute. And we found loads of things about Agatha Christie dotted around the place, including her name in books and one of her typewriters. And one night we burnt her wooden portable toilet seat that apparently she used to take on digs with her as part of the Guy Fawkes celebrations. Not one perhaps for a paper, and maybe not something that we particularly needed to know about, but for me was a really interesting example of how these tiny little stories that people know about and that they've got some sort of connection with Agatha Christie, they can pop up when you perhaps least expect them. So last words, thank goodness for Agatha Christie studies. We've got a lot of work to do, but I think that there's still loads and loads to find out about and to discuss.